Pleasure to be here at SIGGRAPH presenting to all of you. Before I get started, just to get a sense of my audience, how many of you are freelance or work independently or something other than effects or animation? I see a couple. Anybody in a studio of 35 people or less in the room? Anybody from 50 or less? Anybody 85 to 50 in that range? Anybody 100 or more? Oh yeah. So I'm going to discuss how we as a mid-sized studio are surviving and thriving in this economy of mega studios. We'll cover a little bit about the market we're in, a little bit about us, but what I'm hoping is that you guys will take out of this little presentation a little nugget of information that you can bring back to your own studios. So without further ado, I'll get going. So my name is Graham Peddie. I'm the operations director at Rocket Science VFX. I do have experience in this sort of mid-level market. I was at Mr. X for a number of years as their global head of operations and also the head of the Montreal studio. In fact, it was Rocket Science that brought me on board to help them achieve the next level in their growth. They're now transitioning from a small studio to a medium-sized studio, and they're facing all of the hiccups that come along with that kind of growth. So of course, with a studio of this size, really there's two questions that always are relevant to us. You know, how do we remain relevant in the market? And then how do we compete in a market that's really dominated by often much bigger players? So I think before we get too deep into it, I want to show you the reel. It'll give you a sense of the kind of work we're doing, the scope of work, and we'll leave it at that. Let's have a look. So there you have it. And you get a sense of where we're at in terms of our work and the kinds of clients we have. A lot of episodic, a lot of independent film, not really any blockbusters yet. That's the sort of stage in our evolution that we're at right now. And it's interesting how we got there, because it's a little bit different than I think a lot of other studios. It was founded in 2003 by Tom Turnbull and Anthony Patterson, both of whom are visual effects supervisors. They both got tons of experience and are award-winning in their own right. And really, they didn't build the studio to become this mammoth conglomerate. They built it really just to do the projects that they brought in. Well, bit by bit, they brought in more and more projects, and now what started out as 6 people in Anthony's garage is really 80 people in a 10,000 square foot studio that is brand new to us. It's pretty cool as far as studios go. It's got a nice high ceiling. We've got some cool props on the walls. The artists really like it. It's an enjoyable place to be, and we're actually really proud of it. And what do we do? Well, we're pretty much an end-to-end provider now. We actually have a hidden talent of doing previs, and we work all the way through modeling, lighting, comp, effects, the whole 9 yards. And these are the kind of projects we've been doing. You know, our biggest clients right now, predictably, are Netflix and Amazon. We also have a major client in Toronto, Take 5, and between the three, they keep us really steadily busy. And predictably, we've got some awards for some of the work. In particular, a couple of BAFTAs we're pretty proud about. So anyway, that's about us and gives you a sense of our scale, what we're working on, what we're doing. But we find ourselves in this age of what I call the mega studio, right? We see lots of growth in different ways. We see consolidation. You know, Technicolor is buying Mr. X, it's buying The Mill. You see Method buying Atomic Fiction. In other cases, companies are getting private financing. They're branching out into other markets to get new work they've never had before. And then there's just companies like Rodeo in Montreal. They started off as a handful of people, and now they're 700 strong. So they're all growing and growing and growing. And why is that? Well, it's pretty obvious. The demand for effects is greater than it's ever been before. I mean, there's more demand for effects in even the most routine television show these days. I mean, if you look at the box office numbers, the top 10 projects are all effects driven. And if you extend that to look at the top 20, again, 17 of the top 20 are effects driven movies, and the other 3 are CG animated films. So we're in the right business. It's never been busier than it is right now. And part of what's driving this is that there's more screens than ever before. I mean, each of us are carrying around a little mini TV in our pocket. Some of us have 2 or 3, depending on what we're doing on any given day. And those screens mean more need for content. And we're seeing it translate, obviously, into the business side of the world. You know, the 5 biggest studios last year were looking at $12 billion in just North America alone, $42 billion globally. And that's going to be eclipsed this year almost for sure. Stack on top of this what the traditional broadcasters are doing, $37 billion. And then you add premium cable like HBO, all the many and growing OTT providers. And we get a real sense of what's at stake. It's big dollars. And really, in this environment, what everyone wants to do is they're competing for your eyeballs, right? They want your subscription dollar. They want your movie ticket revenue. They want your ad dollar. Whatever their business model, they want you looking at their product. And how are they achieving this? Well, they're increasing the quality. They want to outcompete each other based on budgets, on scope of project. I mean, we're seeing actors in TV that never would have touched a project with a 10-foot pole in the past, right? It used to be if you were a Hollywood film star, TV was like something you did at the end of your career, or if you did it, it was a sign you were a failure. Not the case anymore. I mean, you look at Breaking Bad, which is probably the mold breaker in this respect, and you've got, you know, a 5-season arc of a character turning from a teacher into a drug lord. I mean, if you're an actor, that's a really compelling offering, right? So things are definitely changing. In my view, it's a golden age of television, and in fact, some of the TV products are better than a lot of the films we're seeing even. So what does this mean for the studios? Well, you know, they're all growing to meet this demand, and why not? There's a lot of advantages to being big. You know, if you have 700 people, you've got more capacity. You can handle more shots. You can do 1,000 shots in a month, and it's not a big deal. If you've got more people, you've got more creative juice. Take a problem, divide it by 700 people, and you're more likely to find a solution. There's more stability. I mean, when you're at this enterprise level, you're dealing with the biggest projects, the biggest stakes, and typically you kind of know where these things fall on your calendar. Yes, things push a little bit, but by and large, you can project plan there's some stability there. It's a little bit more challenging, I think, in my opinion, on the small scale. There's infrastructure. If you've grown to 700 people, you've got an IT backbone. You've got a pipeline that works. You've probably got a pretty solid recruiting and training system. All of these things help feed into your 700-person studio. You've got process. Your production team knows how to get things done. You know how approvals work. You know how to get from A to B. And just generally speaking, if you're big, you have more resources. But bigger isn't always better. And in fact, there's a book by Malcolm Gladwell, who's an academic from Toronto. And in his view, giants are not always what we think they are. There are some qualities that appear to give them strength are often the source of great weakness. And in fact, that's true. There's a certain downside to scale as well. As companies get bigger, they become inflexible. It's harder for them to adapt to things that happen in the short term. There's more bureaucracy. The very process that allows them to survive as a big entity by necessity requires middle management. They rely on their middle management to execute much more. The direct leadership kind of starts to fall apart at scale. There's inefficiency. There's more places to hide. It's harder to track to make sure everything's working at optimal efficiency. It's just by virtue of the size. On the tech side, there's legacy. You know, if you make a really big investment in a certain type of technology, a certain type of software, and you've trained and you've bought and you've evolved, and then something new comes along, it's really hard to give up what's gotten you to where you are. Along the same lines as momentum. You know, you're driving your studio in a certain direction. If something new comes along, it's often hard to change. Now, of course, these are not secrets. Big entities know these are issues, and the best studios are working very hard to mitigate them. Still, for us, as a sort of medium-sized player, we're very cognizant of the fact that agility is our main competitive advantage. Because we're small, we can do a lot of things that a bigger company can't do, and we want to maximize that as much as possible. Still, we need to have the capacity of the big studios to execute on some of the shows that we need to do. And two of the tools that we use to do that are Redshift and AWS. So agility lets us compete with these big companies. It makes us, we're able to adapt really quickly. We can be responsive to client demands. You know, if a client asks us for something, we can turn around very quickly. And it makes us innovative. In fact, we're able, because of sort of a lack of legacy in a sense, to really pick up on new technology very quickly, make quick decisions, and implement them right away. You know, but like any growing studio, we still have our pain points. On the leadership side, you know, we're now relying more on a middle management tier. You know, the direct management from Anthony and Tom just doesn't happen anymore at a 70-person studio. Creatively, we are breaking down into departments. It's very common. And technology, you know, we used to do one-off shots, you know, the Wild West. But obviously that's great when you're doing the same shot once. But if we're on a series and we're facing the same issues 10 and 12 and 20 times, you know, we need to have some systems in place, or it just breaks down. It's not efficient anymore. So we're very cognizant of the fact that our agility is at risk, so we're working hard against this too. On the leadership side, we've got a scrub mentality put in place. We have Monday meetings. We have the entire team for any given project come together, whether it's production or an artist, so that everyone feels involved. We set targets for the week, and then we measure them at the following week and expand or contract those goals going forward. Helps us keep it on the ball, helps us keep agile, helps the communication. On the creative side, even though we're breaking down slowly into departments, our CG supervisors are typically generalists. A lot of senior artists are able to straddle multiple departments, and that helps us find those problems in the seams between departments, which is often where those problems creep up. And on the technology side, you know, we're using technology to help us punch above our weight. And that's really what the bulk of this presentation is going to be about. So all this being said, I'm going to now talk about the Expanse, which is a case study which will help illustrate how we use all these different elements, how they all came into play to help us succeed. For those of you who don't know, The Expanse is a science fiction series based on a book by James S.A. Corey. It's produced by Alcon Entertainment, and happily it was picked up by Amazon Prime in season 4. In fact, they just announced season 5, so we're very excited about that. If you were at San Diego Comic-Con last week, they had a sneak preview, and I'm going to play it for you now because it's pretty compelling. All the visual effects shots in this were done by Rocket Science, except for the 2 monitor comps at the very beginning. So it's kind of like a mini reel for us.
fire lined up.
Fire at will.
Take that, Lugu.
Cool. So if you're a fan of the show, like, it's really, season 4 is going crazy. You're gonna see things you've never seen before, go places you've never gone before. It's pretty outstanding. Especially if you've read the books, you know what lies ahead, and it's pretty cool stuff. So Expanse-wise, it was our first real foray into science fiction. As you can see, there's quite a high level of complexity on the modeling side. All that environment, the Illis environment, was all us, and it was all done in Houdini. A lot of modeling for us. Obviously, all the main key ships are ours. We're the main vendor on the ship side, which is kind of fun. For seasons 1 to 3, we rendered on Maya. From Maya on Arnold and V-Ray. We set aside about $250,000 in each season for outsourced render. The results were good, but really it's the inefficiency that was the issue for us. Like, the turnaround times are extremely slow. Artists would send off a shot, and if we didn't want to pull them on to something else and confuse them, they would just sit idle. There were fewer iterations, so it was harder to get the client vision. Sometimes we're up against the clock on an approval. And longer notes. I mean, we get a note back from a client, we'd have to render it, we'd have to wait, and so it wasn't great for the clients either. Obviously, we had some strategies to offset this. We would either render individual frames, or we'd render progressively. Each of these were strategies to sort of minimize the render farm time and still getting us images for dailies, but obviously it's not optimal. In any case, our success in seasons 1 to 3 set us up for work as the primary vendor for season 4. Before we talk about season 4, I take a step back to Into the Badlands. That show was landing just as we were wrapping up on season 3 of The Expanse. Unlike The Expanse, which has a few really high complexity shots, Into the Badlands had a high volume of really mixed shots. Some were complex, but by and large, a lot of them were quite light, let's say. So we needed a way that we could push through both the volume of Badlands with the complexity of Expanse with the finite render resources we had at our disposal. And the question became, how do we do this faster? Well, for us, the answer was Redshift. I mean, it's not really a secret anymore. I mean, by and large, people are aware. Redshift leverages GPU render over CPUs, gives you the CPU quality at a GPU render speed. And for us, the results were outstanding. So basically, shots that were taking us days through V-Ray or Arnold were coming back in hours. If they took hours, they were taking minutes, and allowed us to get much faster iterations. It was also much better at dealing with 4K. So this little benchmark is what we use. If we're doing a shot and it takes an hour at HD, we're doing it in 28 minutes on Redshift. At 4K, it would take us 3 hours on V-Ray or Arnold, and we had it down to 28 minutes. So multiply that across multiple shots and multiple shows, and you can see how much of an efficiency advantage we were able to leverage with Redshift. So obviously, we were satisfied with the test. We implemented it on Badlands. And in order to do that, we had to back off our sort of commitment to CPU. We were replacing a lot of our CPU blades with GPUs. On artist machines, we were putting up beefed up video cards so that at night or during idle periods, the farm would pick up those GPUs and help give us a bit more juice. And in the end, we rendered the entire show 100% on Badlands. And really, it was amazing because the quicker iterations were great for the artists. They got more kicks at the can. They were able to work on a shot much more quickly, get feedback much more quickly, and improve. And in fact, get approvals faster and move on to the next shot, which meant that we were making forward progress that we hadn't seen in the past. Note cycles were great too, because basically the clients were able to give us a note, and we could turn it around and give it back to them very quickly. So artist idle time were minimized, clients were happy. It was really a very, very great improvement over the way things had been done in the past. Another neat thing we did is we started doing 8K models on turntables, which helped us with some planning. We used it on the Expanse for some of our hero spaceships. And really, the net result was that we were able to better achieve our client's vision, which, let's face it, that's what we're all after, right? We want to hit the client's notes, the client's vision on the budget and time that they've given us. So obviously, the success in Badlands made it a no-brainer, really, for us to use Redshift on Expanse. There was a cost to the outset because all the main assets had to be reshaded. It cost us about $55 to $60K to do this, but even our initial forecasts figured we would save about 3 times that amount in render. One limitation we found, though, is that even with our expanded GPU footprint, we didn't have the horsepower to deliver this show with what we had. Our farm consisted of 10 Titan XP nodes, roughly 3 cards each, and we were basically up against a physical limitation at the studio. If we needed more, we had to blow out a wall, put in more cooling, put in more power. Not only was the timeline unfeasible, but we needed approvals from our landlord. We would have needed city approvals. It was a non-starter. So it had to be external render. The challenge was that the vendor we were using did not see a need for GPU. They did not want to invest in the GPU side of the business. It's extremely expensive, especially at that point. If you recall, it was the bit mining craze. Everyone with a GPU was mining Bitcoin. The cards tripled in price almost overnight. And a lot of the third-party cloud vendors weren't yet convinced that it was going to have the staying power that we needed, right? They didn't want to make a big investment to find out 6 months later that something new had come along and it was gone. So it put us in a jam because we knew we couldn't do it without some help, but we couldn't find someone to help us. What we needed was someone with a bit of an aggressive streak, and actually that's where AWS comes into the scenario, because they were at least as forward-thinking as we were, and were able to help us out. So what they were able to do for us is they were able to give us a fleet of compute and virtually whatever variety or flavor or configuration we wanted. Not only was it CPU-based, but GPU-based as well. So we could basically use our Redshift pipeline exactly as we wanted to by leveraging their compute to give us some more juice. This gave us the opportunity to really up our horsepower without making a substantial investment. I mean, the best part of this is there is no subscription, there's no overhead cost. You only pay for AWS when you use it. And setting up a connection was actually pretty easy. We created an Amazon image. Basically, it mirrored our own local image in the cloud, and the level of detail was fantastic, down to the drivers, down to the version of each software we were using. All this designed to make sure that the images, if they were rendered in the cloud or rendered locally, would match. And in fact, they matched exactly. We found that for us that the G3 8X large model was the closest to our local farm, and we use that for our benchmarking, which I'll show you some benchmarks in a minute. So over the course of the show, our peak machine usage was about 110 nodes, but on average, we would use 80 nodes at a time on any given shot. Now, if we have 50 nodes, you can see that already we're more than doubling our capacity on any given shot. Typically, we would plug into the North Virginia data center. At the beginning, that was the easiest and closest. It had the least latency. We found over time that our GPU demands were so high that we needed actually a larger inventory. So we ended up skipping across to Oregon, where they have about twice as many GPUs there than they do in North Virginia. And we used that for basically the rest of the show, which was good. From a tactical execution point, it's actually really easy to use. Everything runs through Deadline. So we have our local render farm, a cloud render farm, everything running through the one software. So with one dashboard, we can track individual jobs, dispatch them locally, dispatch them to the cloud, and really what we kept locally and what we sent out was based on factors such as how big the shot was, how many assets were involved, what production needed, if there was a deadline. But it's very, very easy to track the progress of all your shots all at once. There wasn't like multiple portals you had to go to. Everything was consistent and really easy to manage. But one thing that surprised me a lot, actually, was the level of customer service we got. When we set everything up, I told you about the imaging. We configured everything the way we anticipated it would work, and we ran into an issue with the Rocinante. The Rocinante is that ship that was landing on the planet in the footage I showed you. It's in about 85% of the shots in the show, and we were having an issue with some of the shading. And of course, if we couldn't figure it out, that meant that 85% of our shots were sort of incompatible with the AWS setup. So we engaged them to help, and I was actually shocked by the level of service we got. I mean, we couldn't solve the problem ourselves. We were finding that the error was not happening the same every single time. It was kind of variable, made it really tough to troubleshoot. But AWS gave us access to their TD department. They even went so far as to call Redshift to see if there was some kind of bug in their combined system between ThinkBox, Redshift, and AWS that might have caused the shading issue. In the end, it was actually very simple. It was a little tick box in a submenu that had to be connected. It's not something that we could pick up on our logs. Our logs look clean. We couldn't figure out why. But the TDs on their side were able to pick it up. And once we figured it out, boom, everything was fine. The ship went through like butter. All the shots went through, no issue. But I think it's really important. Like, we're a small studio, 75 to 80 people, depending on what projects are landing. And they treated us like we were really significant and important. And I think that's really key. They could have left us hanging. What are we going to do about it? And I just think that that's something that really surprised me about dealing with, what really is a very, very big company. So over the course of the first, since January really of this year, we've done about 10,000 jobs essentially on Expanse Season 4, locally and on the cloud. That includes shot iterations, finals, and tests and whatnot. You can see in January, February was our POC, our proof of concept with Amazon, where we were doing our testing. So, excuse me, everything was done locally on our local farm. In March, the first sort of final shots were going through AWS, about a 2.5% of the shots that month. But by the end, by July, August, we're into 30% of the show going to AWS. All told, about 20%, so a fifth of the show was done on AWS. And in fact, that fifth was work that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to take. There were other vendors in our network that were working on the show that got bogged down with deadlines or capacity issues of their own. And so the client came to us and said, look, we've got these shots. They're not going to come through these other studios. Can you take them? And of course, we said yes. And we knew that we would be able to do it because we'd had success with the AWS. So that's almost $1 million for us, which as a medium-sized studio is pretty significant. And it really made a material difference. So going back to the render and why it helps, this graph shows two configurations. This is one big shot with 3 layers. AWS is listed at the top. You can see from the second column, we're counting this as 90 machines. 50 machines is our local farm. So you can see the performance. On the last column in orange, it shows you the render times it took to do each of these shots. So we ran this twice, once locally and once on the cloud, to get a sense of how much faster it was. And you can see the times are incredibly fast. I mean, 2.2 hours compared to 6.7 hours. If we look at them collectively as a group, we saved 12.5 hours on that one shot. Now multiply that again across 100 shots or 150 shots, and you really start to see a lot of time saving. And that time was spent into either jumping onto new shots, tweaking, making things better, making the shot, much higher quality. We just got more kicks at that can to make it the best possible delivery. So ironically, one of the things that's happened in the last couple of weeks is that we've been invited to join a show which requires us to do everything in Arnold again on CPU. So as I mentioned, we basically converted our internal farm substantially to GPU, and there's no going back. Like for us, the Redshift solution is just too good. However, the price of admission to this show is that we have to do Houdini and we have to do Arnold. They canvassed the key vendors on this show. That was a sort of common thread through most studios. And in order for us to participate, we got to do the same. Obviously, we're not going back, so we're going to use AWS as our sort of CPU solution for that. And I think, again, this just illustrates the flexibility and agility that a company like AWS gives us. We're able to jump on, in one case, a GPU show, and then right afterwards a CPU show, and it has zero impact on our footprint, on our day-to-day lives. It's something we can count on and keep us busy. And that's really it. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to field them. Yeah?
The new project you just took on mentioned that it was a combination of Houdini and Arnold. Are both of them running in the Amazon cloud for you?
Yes, we're doing tests right now, and that's the goal, is that they're both going to run on the cloud. Yeah?
I have a question that we're sort of doing some early, thank you. We're doing some early tests. One of the things that we found is like with large data sets, getting things into the cloud can sometimes take longer than the render itself.
Right.
So how are you sort of managing that aspect?
So in the beginning, when it was we were doing tests and it wasn't really high density yet, we would send individual shots with assets up and down, like you're describing. But in the end, when things got to crunch time, we basically kept the machine instance running in the cloud at all times to keep the assets live. And that just meant that we weren't uploading and downloading all those assets all the time. It would just pull it out of the cloud right away. And that sped everything up. Like the ingress, egress times was next to nothing.
You kept one like basically a mirror.
Yeah, and it was, it was roughly $20 a day, so the cost was pretty insignificant, but it saved us on the transfer times in and out. So that's something I would look into for sure.
So you basically kept all those assets up to date on the cloud,
Correct.
just on an ongoing basis?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not super familiar with the Redshift. Thank you. The Redshift licensing model, but could you elaborate a little bit on how that licensing works when you're kind of expanding very, sort of sporadically to a large number of nodes that I'm assuming require some sort of licensing, but then
Sure.
not using those at other times?
We have a pool of like local licenses that we can use on the cloud, which is sort of one aspect of going at it. The other way is you can buy credits through AWS, which basically apply to Redshift. So we buy a pool of credits before a weekend, let's say, we run them down and then we replenish them. So it's actually pretty easy. But yeah, you want to keep track because there's the deadline credits you need and there's Redshift credits you need. And I think they're streamlining some of that, but you always want to make sure that you have all the credits for all the different softwares you need so that you don't come up short. Yeah.
What software do you guys use for your RCS burns
Sorry?
in the show?
What do you mean the RCS version? I'm sorry.
All your engine effects.
Oh, Houdini.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? Cool. Well, I'm going to hang around a bit if you have any last-minute questions, and hopefully there's something in here that you can take back and leverage for your own personal use. And thanks for coming. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.